Do you ever sit down like this just scrolling through reels when all of a sudden you get a reel like,
Why does this look so good?
It's skeuomorphism, but not as shiny as Apple used to do it. Let's call it
Flatmorphism.
Well, I figured it out, and it works with pretty much any color.
as a web developer, I see a lot of tutorials like this and they look fantastic, and then I immediately go into how much of a nightmare it would be to develop this. So here's me trying to figure it out. Essentially, this is not going to be in the exact order of the previous tutorial, but this is what a development looks like for just a single button. If I was to use this globally, I would end up just making this global CSS in Elementor and then giving this a custom class so I could easily apply it to buttons pretty much via the assigning of a class. And you'd probably want some different variations for different color buttons, but this is how we did it. So essentially, I just scaled it up for a purpose of this dev so I can see the button a little bit better. We make the text a Z index so it is above everything. Then essentially we give it a mixed blend mode of screen because we didn't have the blend mode that they were talking about in the previous video. I give it an opacity of 0.9 so it brings through some of the depth and all the gradients we added to the background. I had a linear gradient to the button or to the text itself and then clip it so it is a fade from white to a little bit less white on the bottom. Then we also give it a text shadow of white so it's popping a little bit. This was to give it some depth. I unfortunately couldn't add the inner black. I probably could if I messed around with this. And then as we scroll down, what we're doing is essentially adding this gradient overlay to the main part of the button. So we're just adding a pseudo element, and then we give it a width of 100, height of 100%, and then we add that linear gradient and make the border radius match and give it a blend mode of multiply. Plus darker wasn't working here in Elementor, and that is probably an Elementor issue, so we went with multiply here, hence why we went with screen above as well. As we go down, then we're creating this gradient stroke, and there's essentially two parts of the gradient stroke, and what you're going to want to do is first create another pseudo element. I gave this a top or a position of absolute, and then I move it to the left into the top 4, and then give it a calc of 100% plus 8. So you're adding the 8 on the top, and then the 8 on, or for the width, I'm adding the 8 on the left and the right, so it gets 4 on both sides, and similarly for the height. Then you just want to give it the background color that is the same as the color that you were using before, so that is that hex code, and then I make sure that that is behind the main text button. So this is the container of the main button, and then what we want to do is give that gradient that we created for that stroke, we want to give it an overlay. This black, essentially this kind of shiny feature where we have a gradient overlay on it. So then there's actually 2 levels to this. So first you're kind of giving it 2 overlays essentially. So it gets a little bit more complicated here. We use the same code to create the height and width of it, and then we want to give it 2 background layers essentially. So we have a background here, we have 1 linear gradient, which is that black I was talking about, so it's 0% opacity black on the top, 35% in the middle, and 0 again on the bottom. And then we also want to give it a linear gradient of transparent on the top and then white on the bottom, so it's kind of giving it that highlight on the bottom there, giving it that shiny look. And then again, you want to make sure the z-index is -1, and then we give it a border radius of 12. And then we're giving it a mixed blend mode of multiply because we didn't have darker again, plus darker. Lastly, we want to give it a box shadow. So this is a box shadow. I use this tool called Get CSS Scan. They have a bunch of great CSS drop shadows. I don't like to create my own, so I use this resource. Then last but not least, what you're going to be doing is adding this black overlay of kind of around the outside. Now, as you notice, I'm using different selectors in this. There's probably different ways that you could do this. I ended up using the Elementor widget container, and then I had to find a deeper down element, basically in the HTML, that I can make this stroke with, and so I actually ended up using the button wrapper, hence why I had to make the width larger, because I went inside and then I placed it lower by using z-index -2, and then I had to do some playing around with the height and the width because I essentially wanted this to be a 0.5 stroke, and then again here you have the gradient. As you notice, there is no hover animations at the moment. Now that would be something else that would take, I mean, this took about an hour to figure out completely. If I wanted to add hover elements, that would take another, I would essentially just add hover to all of these. So you could add hover here and then start adding different styles. So you'd probably change the gradients or maybe the overlays. If you got real funky with it, maybe you could have them move. But there's some cool stuff you could do here. This is really fun to do. This was a pretty hard button to develop, and it took about an hour. So as you can see, one simple thing like that in development, I mean, that video is about a minute. And again, it wouldn't take a minute to make in Figma, but then to develop this in a way that works takes considerably longer. I mean, that was an hour just on one button. So that's what it looks like developing something like that.
POV, you're trying to make buttons like Jordan Singer. Like,
Why does this look so good?
it's skeuomorphism, but not as shiny as Apple used to do it. Let's call it
Flatmorphism.
Well, I figured it out, and it works with pretty much any color. Start with some text, put it in an auto layout, fill it with a pastel color, add a second fill layer, make it a gradient, set it so the top is black 30% and the bottom is black 0%. And here's where the magic happens. Change the blend mode to plus darker.
Wow, that color is richer.
More rich, really. Now add an inner stroke, make it thick, like 3 or 4 pixels, and set it to the base pastel color. Add a linear gradient. Top is white 100% and bottom is white 0%. The blend mode should be
Soft light.
but it's sort of metallic-y. So add a third layer, make it black 100% on both top and bottom, and add a third point near the middle of black 35%. Oh, and blend mode is plus darker again. While we're still here, let's make the text the same blend mode and fade the fill to 45%. Then add a really faded out linear gradient to add extra depth. Then add a white drop shadow and a black inner shadow.
That text is sunken.
The last step is getting that little border on the outside. Typically, you can add a second stroke through a drop shadow set to no blur and 1 pixel of spread. But this button clearly has a gradient, so that won't work. So wrap this in another auto layout. Add a stroke with the same pastel color and a dark gradient fill. Give the whole thing a beautiful shadow.
And wow, that button is ridiculous.
Seriously, it's epic though.